It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Chana Persoff. We're here in your beautiful home in Neve Daniel in Israel. And Chana, you have the most incredible story about your family.
Okay, thank you. So, as Les said, my name is Chana Persoff, and I was born in Shanghai, China. And I would like you to come with me on a trip to see how it came about that I was born in Shanghai, China, and follow me with my parents from Poland to Lithuania to Japan to Shanghai, and then to America, and me to Israel. So we'll start with my parents, who are the most important people here since they gave birth to me. And we'll start with my father, Yitzchak Shafran. He was born in 1914 in Gawrowa in Poland, and he was one of 9 children. The oldest was a girl, and the rest were all 8 boys. He was a yeshiva bacher, and he actually learned in a town right next to Gawrowa, Ostrolenka, which we'll later see its importance. And he also was affiliated with the Beis Yaakov when he was a young man. Sarah Shanira, who started the Beis Yaakov, came to Gawrowa and asked him to be the administrator in the Beis Yaakov, which is what he also did. And this also will be significant later on in the story. One of the brothers, we called him Uncle Joe, Yosef, was subscripted into the Polish army, and he was actually taken also as a prisoner of war. And the continuation of this will happen when we start after the war starts. Okay, so this was my father's family. They were a very prominent family in Gawrowa. His father was a Rav, and he also many times answered questions of the people in the city when the Rav was absent. And the mother started a business, and they had like a general store. They had a cow in the backyard, and they actually were considered one of the wealthier families in Gawrowa. To give you a bit of a look, we'll show you the Gawrowa family. The two little boys on the bottom, the one on the left is my father Yitzchak, and the one on the right is his brother Yosef. These 2 brothers will become very significant in the whole story, and there are my grandparents and the other siblings. This was taken in 1921, when my father was probably 6 or 7, and they sent the picture to America because some of the brothers were already there, and an uncle, and they wanted them to see pictures of all the children. Okay, so this is the Gawrowa family in 1921, as I said. Here we see the same Gawrowa family in 1935. The couple on the bottom row is my uncle Shrilka and his wife Masha and 2 little girls. They were already living in Montreal. And it's hard to believe today, but in 1935 they actually came from Montreal, Canada to visit their parents. And that's why they took this picture. The man all the way on the left is my father. Uncle Joe, as I said, was in the army, so he is not in this picture. The other significant person next to my father is Uncle Aaron, who, Baruch Hashem, is still alive today. He's the only one, and he's today 101 B'li Ayin Hara. Except for the Montreal family and my father and Uncle Aaron, everybody else in this picture perished. Now we come to my mother, Basia Milnazevich. She was born in 1916 in Ostrolenka, which was actually the other way around. Gawrowa was actually a suburb of Ostrolenka. Ostrolenka was a very, very big city. My father's town was almost like just had a main street and was very, very small. And my mother was from a very Hasidic family, Gera Hasidim, and with a lot of pressure, she decided that she wants to be a school teacher. And she met Sarah Shanira when she was a little girl, and that influenced her very, very much. And also in my mother's family, it's very interesting. It was the mother, her mother, Blima Yehudis, who had a paint store, and she was the more aggressive one, and she made the livelihood for the family. And her father was also a Talmud Chacham, and my great-grandfather, whose name was also Avraham, blew the shofar and did Kriyat Torah, laning on Shabbos, and very chashuv a family. Unfortunately, I have no pictures of this family. Number one, my mother didn't bring any out, but also we were told that they were very frum, and in those days it was not so acceptable to take pictures, so they didn't really have any pictures. Okay, so now we come to September 1st, 1939. World War II breaks out. Germany attacks Poland from the west, and 2 weeks later, September 17th, Russia attacks Poland from the east. Where were my parents at this time? So at this time, my father was probably still with his parents, and my mother was down in Kamenitz, where she was a school teacher. In those days, the school teacher didn't teach in the town that she came from. The acceptable thing was that you taught in a town where you were not so well known as when you were little, I guess, or whatever. And she taught in Kamenitz, and the Ashkiach in Kamenitz was Rav Baruch Ber Leibowitz, who his wife, Fegi Zimmerman, as it turned out, we found out at my wedding, was my husband's great uncle, because Fegi Zimmerman was my Menachem, my husband's father's sister. Okay, so they were related, and my mother discovered this at our wedding, and she then told us that every Shabbos she had like an apartment, or she lived with a family. Fegi Zimmerman would send her daughters over to my mother's little apartment and say, "The Tate zogt azol kommen for Cholent and Torah," that you should come for Torah and Cholent. Just as a little memory, that it was the excitement of my mother, like almost jumping up and down when she met my husband's mother, and they discovered this connection. It was like very, very, it was very, very moving. Okay, so she's in Kamenitz, and the Russians are taking over, and things are getting very difficult. They close all the Talmud Torahs and the schools, and they want all the teachers to teach like they do in public school, also on Shabbos. And my mother begins to sense that things are getting very, very difficult, and that she better leave. Rabbi Grozelsky, who was the Rosh Hashiva, he had already left, and she decides that she's going. She tells her principal that she just got a note from her parents that her father is very sick and she has to go visit them. And they say, okay, you can take leave. And of course she packs all her stuff very quietly, secretly, and she leaves. And when she's on the train going to Ostrolenka, she meets an interesting person. She's sitting on the train, and this red-headed yeshiva boy comes over to her and says to her in Yiddish, "Du bist der Lehrer von Kamenitz? Are you the Kamenitz school teacher?" And she says, yes. So she says, "I have a message for you from Rabbi Grozelsky. He says that you should try to get out of Poland and you should go to Lita." So this was the first spark of the idea of leaving. At this time, many people have already fled, and my Uncle Joe Yosef luckily gets out of the German prison, which is also a miracle. I don't know why they decided to let some of them go, and he went back to Poland, and he goes to Gavarova, and there's no Gavarova. The beginning of the war, if you read the history, the first bombings were in Warsaw, and Gavarova was very close to Warsaw. The whole town was flattened. And I guess I don't know how he figures it out, but he follows the route, and he finds his parents in Lumja, which is going towards the east. And the same thing happens to my mother. She gets to Ostrolenka, but there's no one in Ostrolenka. And she also finds that her parents also are in the Slonim in the Lumja area. By this time, we're already coming towards November, end of November of 1939, and they're trying to think, what they should do. And as I said, they heard rumors that Lithuania is at the moment neutral and you can go to Lithuania. Many people actually did go to Lithuania very easily. They just crossed the border from Poland and they got into Lithuania. By the time my parents got together, my father saying goodbye to his parents, where his parents said, okay, Yosef and Yitzchak, he was called Itcha, they could go, but the other two brothers, Moshe and David, they have to stay here and take care of us. And they say goodbye. My mother had a little more of a difficult time. Her parents were not so eager for her to leave. They said, well, Mishigas, to go to Lita, to run away. And they didn't really allow her to take any of her siblings. And she decided that she's also going. Now, it's very interesting that there are parallel stories that happen here between both my parents, not together. They both say goodbye to their respective parents, and they both decided they're going to go to Lita. By the time they said goodbye and decided, it already was not so easy to just go into Lithuania. You had to sneak across the border, because the border was already closed. So this made it a much, much more difficult task, and you really had to have a lot of courage to do this, because you had to sneak the border. It was minus 40 degrees. The snow was up to your knees, freezing cold. You had most of your clothes on your back. Maybe you had a little suitcase. And that's what many people, young people mainly, decided to do. They had some kind of gathering area where people decided they have to get a Polish non-Jewish person with a wagon to help them to get across. And different groups are formed. My father and Yosef are in one group. My mother, who they see in the distance, is in another group with some of her students. They both have pretty harrowing stories of crossing, because you get to a certain point with the wagon, but then you have to walk quite a bit. My father's story is that they're walking in the snow with a group of youth. The groups were usually between 10 and 12 people, and one of the women in the group, who was also a school teacher, she fell. And most of the people in the group say, we can't wait, we just have to continue and go on. And my father says, no, we have to help her, we have to go back. So Yosef and my father help her up, and they continue walking. As they continue walking further on, my father, who was always very weak, he had rheumatic fever as a little boy in Poland, he feels very faint, and he says to Yosef, I can't go on. That's it, I have no koyach, And then the school teacher remembers that she has a candy in her pocket, and Yosef tries to find the candy in the pocket and gives it to my father, and this helps to revive him a little bit, and then they continue going. Then they continue on, and then they see in the distance a farmhouse with a little light. It's late at night. And they say, okay, let's try to go into this farmhouse. We don't care who's there. You get desperate. And we need to get warm. They were freezing. They hadn't eaten, for sure not. And they get to the farm, and obviously not Jewish people. And the first thing they ask them, they say to them, tell us, where are we? They didn't even know if they had really managed to cross the border yet. And he says, you're in Lithuania. So they at least sighed a sigh of relief that they had already crossed the border. However, the man tells them that there are Russian soldiers patrolling and checking, because a lot of immigrants were already flowing into Lithuania, and they didn't really like that. So then he says he hears them coming, he quickly hides them up in the roof, and then the soldiers knock on the door, and they say, did you see two men and a woman? And they said, oh yeah, they were here, but they went that way, the other way. And luckily they believed them. They didn't search the house. And then they came downstairs, and this man was very, very good. He said, you can't just go into the center of Lithuania like this. So he gave them a wagon, and gave them eggs and vegetables and gave them some peasant clothing. And this way, they won't notice so much that you're immigrants, that you're somebody different. It's interesting that my mother had the same, she doesn't have the story of getting into a farmhouse, but the same story of meeting some good Lithuanian non-Jew who helped them with a wagon, and they were able to get into the central Lithuania. So when they came to Aishashuk, which is at the border of Lithuania, and then they had to get to Vilna. So they get to Vilna, and there's real chaos there. Vilna was a town with a lot of Torah. It was called Yerushalayim Dalita, and the Lithuanian Jews were trying to be very helpful, but there were tens of thousands of people coming into Lithuania, into Vilna from Poland. And from a lot of the history that I've read, Lithuania was not exactly economically in such a great position to help out so many immigrants. Then with the help of the JDC and Hayes, people started getting organized. They started getting apartments for a lot of the people, and they started settling down. I was surprised to discover that they really were in Lithuania for quite a while, like over a year and a half. My parents never spoke about that time, and I didn't find very much written about what they really did. My mother probably learned with the Beis Yaakov girls. My father found yeshiva, and he was learning. My uncle, who was always very enterprising, probably found some work. And at the time, there were many yeshivas. There were different yeshivas there. Chachmei Lublin. There was the Mir, of course, was there almost in its entirety. And there were also many Zionist groups. There were Bundes. There were a very colorful mixture of people there. One of the prominent people in the Zionist group was Zerach Warhaftig, who later became the Minister of Religion here in Israel. And he was running back and forth and writing letters to America, to the Halotz. He was basically trying to get people to go from there to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel. And he was in touch with all these people, but things were moving very, very slowly. I think he started some sort of hachshara there, Bnei Akiva, that were really trying to get ready to go and to a kibbutz and to build up the country. As time went on, everyone started feeling, and Zerach Warhaftig was one of the people that was pushing for this very much, that things are not going to stay so nice and calm, that we're going to stay here in Lithuania, in Vilna, and everything will be okay. The Russians are not going to be so accommodating, and we really have to figure out how to leave Lithuania, Vilna. At the same time that they're trying to think of what to do, a few interesting things happen. First, a woman called Pascal Lewin, who is a Dutch, Holland Dutch descendant, she discovers that there may be a way to leave Vilna, Lithuania, and get to one of the Dutch islands. She approaches and writes a letter to Decker, who was the ambassador, and she proposes this idea to him. And he says, yeah, well, there is this island in the West Indies called Curacao. You have to get there through Japan. Okay. Somehow he is convinced by her to write a letter that just says that to go to Curacao, you don't need a visa. And this is one of the miracles of the whole story here. And he says, okay. And he writes this note that says to go to Curacao, you don't need a visa. So at least she has stage one. And then at the same time, there's a yeshiva bacher called Nathan Gutworth, who's also from Holland. And he approaches John Zwratnik, who is he was actually a businessman who also was sent to Kaunas, which is the capital, as not an ambassador.
It was for Phillips.
he
was
worked
a
for Philips,
representative.
and he was sent to be on to be the consulate in Lithuania. So here's a businessman, not anything to do with politics, and he's sent there to be the consulate. So Natan Giltworth also, at the same time, I think, as Pessalou, I don't know who came first.
She was first, but
she was first, and then it started the ball rolling. And because Decker, though, had written to Pessia Lewin that he agrees to write this note, this gave the gushpanka to John, the consulate, that to further write another note, saying also that you do not need a visa to go to Curacao. And so this is what this happens, and then they see, okay, so now we have this visa that we can go to Curacao through Japan, but now how do we get to Japan? So at this point, at the same time, we have Senpo Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat, and he is suddenly sent in, I think it was probably December 1939, if I'm right, December 1939, November, before Hanukkah, and he's sent to Kaunas, and he also opens a consulate. Now, people say that he was sent there by the Japanese government to keep an eye on the Russians, on the Germans, and he settles down with his family. I think then he had only 1 or 2 children, and he settles down there. And what happens is there's a rush to Sugihara's house. The story tells it that all of a sudden at night, the Sugihara family, is already going to sleep, and suddenly they hear a muhuma, a lot of noise, a lot of people outside their house, and even the little boy Haruki says, what's going on? What do all these people want? Finally, during the day, they here we have, it's a very famous picture of people who are into the story of the people at the gate clamoring in front of Sugihara's house, lining up. In the end, what happens is they get to understand that these people.
It's a picture of Sugihara.
Okay, here we have one of many, picture of Sugihara. Okay, and and then so Sugihara says, okay, these people want help. A delegation of 5 people are asked to come to his house to explain what's happening, and they come and they explain to him that they have this visa. It's not really a visa. They have this piece of paper from John with the gushpanka of Decker that they can go to Curacao without a visa. Little did they know that the governor of Curacao would not have let them in, because they didn't really have an entry visa to go into Curacao, but that's how things worked in those days. So they explained the story to him, and he knows that this is against the what his government would want him to do. And after a lot of deliberation, even though he sent 1 telegram to Japan and they said, no, you can't do this, Sugihara decides that he is going to do this.
He said there were 3.
What?
3 telexes.
Right, 3
And Japan and Germany were allies.
Right, they kept saying, you can't do this, you can't do this. Then he has like a concilium with his wife and his wife's sister who lived with them, and even Haruki, who was only 5 or 6 years old at the time. They say, what should we do? And they all decide, we have to help these people. And that's the beginning of Sugihara starting to issue these visas. The visa is actually not so easy. It has a stamp and a lot of Japanese written. Later on I'll find a picture to show you a picture of the visa itself. And he begins working. Moshe Zupnik, who was a Mir Yeshiva student, offers to help him, and some of them help him with the stamp and with some parts of the visa that they could do. A lot of it is written in Japanese, which is very difficult to write. It takes a long time. And the story has it that, here we have a picture of the visa, that it was very, very difficult writing, and he would stay up all night and write, and his hand was really hurting him, but he was very determined to help as many people as he could. Many people got the visa as families. My father, to go back to the personal story, my father and my uncle had at this time procured in Vilna Polish passports, which also a lot of the yeshiva bachas from Mira got. They organized it and they all had Polish passports, which made things later on a little bit easier. And my mother marries my father fictitiously, and so my father puts my mother on his visa, and they each have this visa. So now we'll take a break from the personal story and we'll speak a little bit about Sujihara. Sujihara, the actual numbers vary because we have printed about 2,000 to 3,000 visas, but there were many families. I mean, my father was just my father and my mother, but there were some families that were 4 or 5 people, and they were all on the same visa. So 3,000 visas could be 8,000, 10,000 people. So he did a lot of, printed a lot of visas, and then about August 1940, he really had to leave. He started issuing the visas in about July 1940. The whole thing that we're talking about here was about a month. And then he had to get on the train, and he left some of the papers with a stamp, and people say that some people might have filled in some of it, but he just really had to go already. Sujihara was very highly admonished by the Japanese government for this. I think straight from there they went to Berlin, and then he was demoted, and he really, really suffered a lot. After the war, I can't say he disappeared, but nobody really knew very much about him, about the story. No one spoke about it. And it was only very, very much later that the Japanese realized that what they did of demoting him and treating him like that was really not the right thing to do. And we're talking about 1980, like really a long time after the war. And today they have a whole Park of Humanity in Sujihara's name, and they even have a Sujihara Day, because he is now considered a person that did the right thing. He was there to help people. In 1984, first I should backtrack, he was then by Yad Vashem recognized as a righteous Gentile, and in 1984 they actually made a stamp with 5. There were 5 people. The main one was Sujihara. Here we have the first day issue of this stamp, with Sujihara, I think, is on your left, and you can see even a bit of the visa here. I went to this ceremony. It was very, very moving. Sujihara was not alive already, but his wife Yokiko was there, and here we have an interesting picture of me and Yokiko. She was a very little lady. Those of you who know me, I'm about 5 feet tall, and she came up to my shoulder, so she was a really tiny little lady. Eventually, she with her son Haruki, who was 5 years old at the time, wrote this beautiful book called Visas for Life. And what's beautiful about this book is this is a book written from her point of view. Not only about the time in not only about the time that they were in Lithuania, in Kaunas, but their whole life, where they went through, where they traveled, the difficulties, the ups and downs that they went through. Later on in Israel, after the stamp, this is much later, there was a boulevard in Netanya that was going to be dedicated to righteous Gentiles. as I say, was my luck would have it, but the first street that was dedicated was for Tsujihara. And his surviving son, Nobuki, because the other sons were no longer alive, came, and there was the Japanese ambassador, and it was a very big ceremony. What was very moving about the whole afternoon was that before they had the whole official ceremony in the big auditorium with the mayor of Netanya and all these different the Japanese ambassador, etc., they invited people like myself and other survivors. Now, I'm a sort of a second generation survivor. In other words, I never knew Tsujihara, but there were people there that were much older than me that actually knew Tsujihara, and they came there to speak to Nobuki, and it was very, very, very moving. The other thing that happened at that time was the day before. I didn't know about this, unfortunately. The day before, they sent a taxi to pick up Rebbetzin Chaya Bilakovsky, who was, she passed away since then, who was the now Amshinova Rebbe's mother. And she actually remembers Tsujihara, and she was much older than me, so she knew the story firsthand. They brought her and Rebbetzin Ezrachi, who was she also has since passed away. This is me with Rebbetzin Ezrachi, and they went to the Mir Yeshiva. So here we have Nobuki, his wife, who's not Chinese, she's Western though, and a few other of his entourage in the Mir Yeshiva, and we have there beautiful footage of Chaya Milakovsky saying to Tsujihara, "You don't know what your father did. Because of him, I am alive. Because of him, we are here." And it was very, very moving. There's also footage of one of the somebody else, a Haredi man, is standing there in front of him and crying and saying, "It is because of you that I am alive today, that I am here." It was very moving. So that was really the day before. And this was the next day. So here we have, I'll show you first. This is a picture of me with Nobuki. And here we have the street. You can get this. And it's very interesting that many times you have a street that just has the name of the person. And here it's very nice that they actually wrote a bit of the story. They wrote that, this is in Hebrew, okay, Chasidu Mot Olam, that he's a righteous Gentile. He was born in 1900 to 1986. He passed away. Consul Japan Belita Bisman Milchelet Olam Hashniya. He was the consul in Japan during the Second World War. Hitzil Alfei Yehudim Panfiko Ashrot Maval Yitziah Milita, and he gave many visas for people, for them to be able to go out of Lithuania. So this is very nice, because usually a street doesn't have so much detail. Here we have another picture of the street with the Japanese ambassador and
Nobuki.
Nobuki.
And Hani, you have a picture with Sally?
Okay. One of the survivors that was at this meeting was Sally Ganor, who met Tsujihara when he was 10 years old. And tell the story? The Hanukkah? Okay.
He was 12.
What?
12 years old.
12 years old? Oh, he was older. He was 12 years old. And he was in his aunt's store, and he had no money. He wanted to borrow some money from her. It was Erev Hanukkah. Maybe it was already in the middle of Hanukkah. And of all people, Sujihara is also in the store, and he sees this little boy who has no money, and he says, I'll lend you some money. He says, I can't take money from you. You're a stranger. I don't know you. And they exchange some words. And Mihon Lahon, this little 12-year-old boy invites Sujihara and his family to their house for Hanukkah candles. And Sujihara and his family, go to the Ganor. I think his name was different then.
Genkind.
What?
Genkind.
Gentkis, okay. Change it to Ganor. And they get to see a little bit a Jewish family in an interesting family setting. Unfortunately, Sali did not manage to get a visa, and he was sent to, I think, the Vilna ghetto.
Kovna, he was in Kovna.
The Kovna ghetto. He himself wrote an amazing book, Light One Candle. What? Light One Candle.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult book, but a beautiful book that I've read of all the trials and tribulations that he went through. As you can see, Baruch Hashem, in the very end, he made it to Israel. And here I am with Sali. Unfortunately, he passed away a few months ago. He passed away. He was 93. He was very connected to the Sujihara family. When they had the ceremony in Japan, he actually went and he met Sujihara's wife, and that's a whole another story. Okay, so now we have the visa. That's one step of the way. Now we have to get to Japan. Here I'll show you a map of what they had to do. Every time I look at this map, I cannot believe that they actually did this. I don't know if you can get this. In the black on the right is Moscow, and all the way here is Vladivostok, and here's Japan. So according to this map, you can see that you have to go across the entire length of Russia to get to Japan, and the only way to do that, to get to Vladivostok first, is to go by train, and that's the route that you have to take. But these Jewish immigrants that have already escaped one part of the way are not going to give up, and they say, okay, so now we have to go and get onto the train in Moscow. So they go to Moscow. This is already a much more difficult proposition than getting the visa from Sujihara. People who went to Sujihara, anyone that came, even they said we're a whole family, they got the visa from him. He didn't ask too many questions, what's your name, but he didn't ask where you're from, and he gave out the visas. To go to the NKVD then, which is like the KGB today, or was a little more difficult to get permission, because the Russians, as Russians, were very much, why do you want to leave Russia? And would ask you all kinds of questions. Even at this point, just as people, I didn't point this out, many people didn't even want to take the Sujihara visa either. People were afraid. Not everybody had the courage to do these things. So many people said, what, to go ask permission from the Russians to leave Russia? It's for sure going to be a malkodet, a trap, and they were afraid to do it. But many people decided that they were going to do it. My father and Uncle Joe and my mother decided that they're going to do this. Besides getting the permission from the Russians, you also had to have $180 to pay to get on the train. $180 in those days was like thousands of dollars. It was really a lot of money. If you could imagine, here you are in Moscow. The war is going on, and you're thinking, how are you going to get dollars? They also wanted it in dollars. So as I said, my Uncle Ben was already in America. So my father and Uncle Joe write to their brother, Uncle Ben, and ask them for the money. My mother at the same time somehow discovered that she had a cousin in Brooklyn, Brooks, family Brooks, and she gets money from them. Just recently, Uncle Ben's son found this receipt from the Chase National Bank, which is amazing document that shows that on January 15th, 1941, this check was sent for $370. This was the money for my father and for Uncle Joe to get onto the train. Okay.
I mean, in those days, there was a fortunate amount of money.
It was like $10,000, my uncle said. It was really, really a lot of money. Now, what happened here was that my mother had a false Polish passport, and my father and Uncle Joe, they had Polish passports. So their whole checking in with the NKVD went very smoothly. My mother was very frightened because she knew that her papers weren't 100%. She also had to make sure that she was always with my father, which didn't always happen because she was on his visa. So she waited in line to get the stamp from the NKVD. She said that they actually lined up from 12 o'clock at night so they can get there first thing in the morning, and they waited. She's waiting in line, and there was a woman in front of her, and she got nervous. She said to the woman, I'm sorry, it was her turn, and there was a woman in the back of her. She says, no. She says, I don't know, you go first. So she let, and everybody was happy to go first. So she sent this other lady to go in front of her. Then it was her turn, and she gets into this room. And as my mother, she was also a little lady, she described, she walks in, this woman looked like 6 feet tall, this Nina, this big Russian lady. My mother was petrified. And she starts to ask her questions, and then she stamps one part of her paper, and she didn't finish. And my mother just really said, I don't know, something's going to go wrong. Just then Nina gets a phone call, and how people get a phone call and they turn away. And she turns away, and when she turns away, my mother runs out of the room. And people start running after her, and she gets away. So the whole time that my mother is on the train, which they finally do get onto the train, she's hiding, and she's very nervous, and she thinks that they're going to catch her and they're going to send her away. The actual train is really a luxury train. One day maybe I'll get to see it, go on it, I don't know. And but during the war, it was very, very frightening, because some pictures I've seen, beautiful scenery, but every time the train stopped and soldiers got on and soldiers got off, during the war, when you just see a soldier with the boots marching, you freeze and you get very, very frightened. And it's a 2-week train ride. So in 2 weeks, there are a lot of stops. And every time the train stopped, everyone was very, very frightened. But Baruch Hashem, they got to Vladivostok. However, they get to Vladivostok, and again, my mother and the 2 brothers, they get into trouble. They go the wrong way, and their papers are not in order, and they say, we don't know if we're going to let you get on the boat to go to Japan. There's a whole little discussion there. And they say, well, the Russians say, why should we send them back to Russia and we have to deal with them? We'll send them to Japan and let the Japanese take care of them. Okay, so then but they already have, like, almost telegraphed, like a notice to Japan that there's these 3 people that we're not sure about their status and everything. So they get onto this boat, which is a very rickety boat, which they're on this boat for 3-4 days. Of course, the boat is probably has 10 times as many people that really should be on the boat, and it's not so pleasant, but they finally do get to Japan. They get to Japan, and again they have to go through a certain procedure, and for whatever reason, the 3 of them are marked, and they say, I don't know, these 3 people, maybe they're spies, we don't want to let them into Japan. And they decide that they're going to send the 3 of them to Shanghai. Okay, so the 3 of them are sent straight away off to Shanghai. Before we get to Shanghai, we're going to take a little break and speak about Japan for a minute. At the time that my parents got there, many Jews came to Japan, and they were coming in, more Jews and more Jews. The actual visa that Sujihara gave all these people was valid for 2 weeks. Soon we'll speak about another righteous Gentile, Professor Kozuchi, who was very interested in Judaism and literature. He was really a Shinto, from the Shinto religion, and he respected the Jewish people that were there, and he fought very hard. Every time the visa went out, he convinced the authorities to allow the Jews to stay, and they continued to stay, and they continued to stay. All in all, I think they stayed about 6-7 months. At the beginning, though, the Japanese wanted a meeting with somebody from the Jewish community. The Amshinover Rebbe, then, Rev Shimala, who was Chaim Nechama's grandfather, he was one of the people that escaped with his family. And in one of the books that David Kranzler wrote, he said that the Amshinover Rebbe said, Ich gehe, like I'm going to get the visa, and I'm going to go to leave Lithuania. So they decided to send him to speak to this whole committee. And here is a famous picture. I won't go through all the names. The Amshinover Rebbe is in the middle. Shapiro is on the right, and Professor Kojusi is the one here with the mustache. And so he comes to meet these people, and they say to him, tell us, why do the Germans hate you so much? What is it about you that they hate so much? So he says to them, well, you know that we're Asian. And then they get a little bit shocked, because they're also Asian. And then he goes into a little more detail and says to them, you don't look exactly like the Germans, the Aryans, the blonde, you also look a little bit different. And this somehow impressed them and said, okay, maybe they're not so bad after all. And they agreed, and they let them stay. And in the end, they...
Can I just say a quick thing here?
Yeah.
So what I had read is that Amshinover Rebbe was a very brilliant man, and he said that he had read that the Japanese, he was official in the embassy in Berlin, wanted to marry a German, and they never got a marriage certificate. They wouldn't give him a marriage certificate. They wouldn't allow a German to marry the Japanese.
Yeah. So that was an extra, like, hochacha, proof of how the Germans feel about the Japanese. Mm-hmm. So it gave them a little titter, this could happen to you as well. Okay, so now we go to Shanghai. My parents come to Shanghai. A little bit about Shanghai is divided up into many different concessions. There's the French concession, the international settlement. My parents actually go first to Hanqiu, which is a small little section, a very poor area. As my mother described in one of the oral histories that we took, when the first 6 months that they were in Japan, in Shanghai, were very, very difficult, because they were there without their friends, and they didn't really have any money, they didn't have any means. And the Rabbi Ashkenazi, who was the chief rabbi of Shanghai, he helped them very much. He helped them find rooms and helped them find food. I just want to say on the side that also in Japan, and keep going to Japan, also in Shanghai were about 20,000 German Jews who had escaped and came there early 1940s, and they didn't go through the same route that my parents went through, and the Polish refugees. They came from Germany to Italy by boat straight to Shanghai. So that's a whole different story. There were also many Iraqi Jews. There were many Sassoons, very wealthy families. There were Russian Jews that had come also in the early 1900s. It was a very big melting. It was a very international city. It's a port city. Indians from India. There was the Silk Route. So there were many different people. Very crowded city, very hot city, very dirty city. A lot of dysentery people. You could see people in the street not alive, and it wasn't a very easy place to come to from Poland, to say the least. What I recently, a few years ago, we found some very amazing letters that were written to mostly one to my father and mostly to my mother, from Poland. Some of them were written from Poland in 1941, in July of 1941, which means that they already knew, my mother's family, that they were in Shanghai. From the letters, we also see that they knew that she was with the brothers Shafran. So it's interesting to see how the mail did get across. At the same time, and this is how I got to really see how long it took for my mother's friends to come. There were many postcards, and more postcards than letters, really, okay? Many postcards from Japan, from my mother's friends, writing to her, how are you doing, what's happening, we're still in Japan, we're hoping to stay. You could see from the letters that they weren't sure that they really wanted to come to Shanghai. These were mostly women, friends of my mother's. There was one postcard from my father's friend, and trying to get certificates. Some people trying to go from there to Israel, some people were trying to go to America, but there was a quota. Everything was very unsure. People did not know what was going to happen. In the end, most of the people that got the visas did come to Shanghai. For example, Zerach Warhafdik, he got to Japan. He actually even went to Shanghai to see how things were doing and went back to Japan. That's how he was so involved in caring about the people. But he managed with his family and his oldest son, Emmanuel, to get to America. And then from America, later on, he came to Israel. And 6 months later, when the Miri Yeshiva came and all my mother's friends came, things were looked up, were much better. Now,
and can I just also, for a brief second, it was Zorpa Haftik, he was the one that went to Rav Finkel and Rav Malin and said, you have to leave. And and they listened to him because they knew his father, who was very close to the Chazon Ish. And they agreed, and that's why he was very instrumental in the Mir being saved.
Right. He was very forceful, and as I said before, people really needed to be convinced, because everything you did had a risk, and some things were a risk and it worked out, Baruch Hashem, and some things, so for some people, didn't work out. Now to get back to Japan, to Shanghai, I keep saying. Just to give you an idea, when you got to Shanghai, you had to get like a Tzudat Zehut that we say in America, in Israel. And this is my mother's and this is my father's, which are very interesting documents. This is your identity card, which you had to keep with you at all times. And you could see the fingerprint on the bottom, because they didn't know how to sign their name in Chinese, of course. The back is written in English, not that they knew English at the time at all. And this is what you had to have. How did they settle into Shanghai? As I said, most of the people settled in Hankyu, which was not such an easy place. It was very poor, very crowded. A lot of families lived together. It was just a sheet separating one family from the other. And now the Mir Yeshiva, here were about 350 Bachurei Yeshiva. What are they going to do? Then this is another one of the miracles of the story. There's a story that a man called Silas Hardum, who was Jewish, very assimilated, married to a Chinese woman, and very wealthy. And the story goes that he had a dream, and his father came to him and said, you have so much money, what have you done for the Jewish people, for something like a little Yiddishkeit? And he woke up and he was very disturbed by this, and he some say that it was Rabbi Ashkenazi that he spoke to, and he was given advice, and he decided to build a big shul. He built the shul, the Ohel Aron shul. Was a big shul. It was in downtown Shanghai. It was not near Hankou, and it was a very, very big building. Those of you who know the story, there's a very famous picture of the Mir Yeshiva boys sitting in the learning there. They had enough seats for just about the amount of boys, and in the basement was a kitchen, so they were able to cook and make hot meals for themselves. Some people were allowed to continue and stay all through the war years that they were there. In that area next to the Ohel Aron Shul, like the Amshner Rebbe, continued to stay there. Rabbi Walken stayed there, who was a big one of the Rebbes in the Mir. However, after Pearl Harbor, many of the Japanese became much more harsh, and they made most of the Jews move, including a lot of the German Jews, move into Hankou, and things became much more difficult. You needed a special pass, which the yeshiva boys got a special pass. This is my father's pass as a yeshiva boy, that he was able to leave the Hankou ghetto to go to the yeshiva, but people that wanted to leave had to wait in line a long time to be able to go out, to go different places, just to leave the ghetto. And sometimes you waited in line the whole day, and at the end he didn't give you the pass. The story has it that at the end of the war, a lot of people beat him up. They were so angry at him. Okay, so my mother is living in the dorm with her friends, and a lot of them were Beis Yaakov teachers. And my mother decides that with her friends that we have to start a school for the girls. There are all these girls, a lot of them from the German refugees as well. And the girls also have to learn. Here are all the boys, they're all learning in yeshiva. What about us women and all these little girls? So she writes this letter, which was printed in the Yiddische Stimme von Weiten Mizrach, for the Jewish voice of the Far East. My brother found this letter a number of years ago, and it was written in Yiddish, of course, and we translated it into English, and I already translated it into Hebrew. I'll just read you one paragraph where she writes, "We, a group of teachers and friends of the Beis Yaakov movement, who were torn from our homes by the stormy waves of war and tossed to distant Shanghai, declare, no, inside every one of us still echoes the holy will of our mother, Sarah Shanira. My children, wherever you may be exiled, in whatever situation you may find yourselves in, continue devoting your energies to building the Beis Yaakov movement, to which I dedicated my life." Okay, so she writes this letter, and she starts going to different askanim and people, and she's getting money. I read recently that she even wrote to Rebbetzin Kaplan in America, and they started getting some help, and they got a building, and they actually put together a Beis Yaakov in Shanghai. And even my father, who I told you there was a connection of him to Beis Yaakov, he taught the seminary girls. And here is a picture of, this is in 1944 already. You could see how many more students they had. And I don't know if you could see it in the camera, in the middle with the hat, with her head a bit on a tilt, is my mother. Quite a few of the ladies there are people that I eventually met. In 1942, just when she's starting the school, my father and my mother, Baruch Hashem, finally get officially married. Here they are. close up. Here she is in her wedding dress, a little longer. And they got married. Another interesting picture, before my mother's wedding picture, this is a picture of the school teacher that fell in the snow, Yenta Rubel Manis. And on the, over here, this is my mother. Here she is not married yet. She eventually wore the same dress as this lady. I see they had a different headdress. Here is a more of a group picture of my mother's wedding, where many of the women in the picture, the Yaakov teachers, were many women that I met eventually. Rebbetzin Kravitz, her husband with the Rosh Hashiva, Arte J, Rebbetzin Steinberg, Rebbetzin Hellman, whose husband, Rabbi Hellman, was my principal in Beis Yaakov. Another interesting wedding picture is this one, where you could see some of the German girls that came to the wedding, who you could see are dressed very differently from the girls on the right. And what is interesting about this photo is that at the beginning, the German immigrants, the Jewish immigrants, and the Polish didn't get along that well, and but things started easing up a little, especially when they had to start living together, and then some of the children from the German refugees, they came to the Beis Yaakov, and I think things started warming up a little between them, and the fact that they came to the wedding shows that they did become a little bit more close to one another. As most of us know, the Germans and the Poles were very different in their culture. At the same time that my mother was starting a Beis Yaakov, the German Jews had cafes, they had cultural events, they put on plays, they continued their type of life, and they continued their life of like learning and the Beis Yaakov, and for the most part, I think things were pretty harmonious.
Hannah, can I ask, at the wedding,
Yes.
Did your parents mention who were the Rabbonim or who signed the ketubah?
Oh, so Rabbi Ashkenazi, the chief rabbi of Shanghai, he actually was the Masader Kedushin. He made the wedding, and the Amshin of a Rebbe, Rev Shimala, he made Sheva Brachos for my parents, and he was also, I think, maybe my brother. I didn't say it, but my brother was born. And he was at the bris, and my brother, they had a pidyon haben, so we were very close to Amshinov. And a little curious, we'll skip to America for a second. The Amshinov had a shtibel in Borough Park on 53rd Street, 15th Avenue, and we used to go there. And I still remember Rav Shimala sitting at the head of the table having a tish. Then it was really a shtibel. The men davened in the living room, dining room, and the women, we were in the kitchen. And my sister and I, we were maybe 4 and 3, or we used to peek through the kitchen door to look at the men, and Rav Shimon would call us over and give us a candy. And that's one of the memories that I have from when I was a little girl. So as I said, so in 1944, my brother was born, and then I was born. Here you could see an example, which is very interesting. This is my kartis tipat chalav, as we say in Israel, with the different inoculations that I had to get for cholera, typhus, all kinds of terrible things. Not for corona. And this is what everybody had to have. And so now we're getting to 1945, and the war is over. I have to say that in 43, 44, a little bit news of what happened in Poland started trickling through. And there's one famous picture of the people, the Bachurim in Shanghai. There's a board with a list of names, and people are trying to see what happened to everyone. According to the names that my brother and myself that we have, they still didn't know for sure what happened to their families. My brother's named after a grandfather, and I'm married after a grandmother. Actually, a grandmother and grandfather were married to each other, which is just interesting. And by the time my sister was born in 1947, she's already she's already named after the two grandmothers, because then they already knew that what really happened in Europe. After that, my parents were actually very lucky, and they were able to go to America, and they came to San Francisco. This is after my sister was also born, so 3 of us, 1, 2, 3. It wasn't very easy, and they get to San Francisco, and they were greeted there by a rabbi from Los Angeles that heard that refugees are coming, and he helped them out to settle them, give them some money, some food. They were there for about a month. I forgot about my Uncle Joe. He actually left a little bit before my parents, and he did the same route. But my Uncle Ben and Uncle Aaron, they all lived in New York. So one in Brooklyn and one in Queens. So they sent them money, and again they took this train all the way from San Francisco to New York, which also took about 2 weeks, a very long trip, with 3 little tiny children. And they found my parents an apartment in Borough Park, and that's where we settled down. My parents obviously did not know English. They started going to night school, like Ulpan here in Israel, to learn English, which is a very, very different language from Polish, and they knew a little Russian, I think, but mainly they spoke Polish, and Yiddish, of course, they spoke Yiddish. So with the Yiddish, they were able to get along with the other local Jewish people that lived in Borough Park. And my father was, I don't know if I mentioned, he got smicha in Poland, so he was a mashgiach kashrut for a while. And then my mother started selling ladies' undergarments in the house, in the little apartment that we had. And slowly she built that up into quite a famous, popular store. And from being not very well off and very poor, we eventually became very comfortable, I should say. At the same time, she still continued giving lectures on Shabbos. She used to give a shiur to the L'Shei Agudas Yisrael, so she continued a little bit her teaching skills, but basically she really supported the family. And one other thing about me, so then I just have a very cute picture here of the 3 of us. What did I do? I guess we'll do this. This is the 3 of us. I'm the one on the right, and that's my brother in the middle, who lives today in California. My sister still lives in Borough Park. She's on the left. So this is the 3 little kids. This is already, we're a little bit older, because my sister was a baby when we came, so this is a few years later. What's interesting always to me is how my parents still took us to have a proper photograph with a photographer in color. Very nice.
Beautiful.
Okay, so I went to Beis Yaakov, my brother went to Torah Semes, then to Torah Vidas, and all of us went to high school. I, in the end, in 1967, came to Israel, and then I met my husband. First I studied social work. I was here for a few years single, and then I met my husband Menachem. Maybe he'll come into the picture for a second. I had a picture, but at least you could see him in person. Help me with the family thing.
This is lovely.
Hi everybody.
Okay, so I was studying social work, and then I met Menachem, and we got married in 1973, just before the Yom Kippur War. And Baruch Hashem, we have 4 children, Kaina Hara, and they're all married and they all live in Israel. And this is, it's a little outdated, but this is one of the group
That's beautiful.
family pictures that we have. Okay, I didn't tell the story about the museum, but okay. And now we have get them in order. So as I said, coming up now is the Nachas. And this is, as a lot of people say also, if we go back to Sujihara, how what one person helped one couple, and Baruch Hashem, look what we have. And this is only my family. And my brother Baruch Hashem has, he also has 4 children. 2 of them live in Eretz Yisrael. They also live here in Israel. 2 live in Muncie. My brother lives in California. My sister has a very large family. She still lives in Borough Park. And from two people, okay, one couple, we have maybe over 100 children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And it just shows you, the famous pasuk, Misha Metzil
Nefesh
Echad B'Yisrael,
saves the whole world.
Saves the whole world, which is written in a lot of the books about Sujihara that they say to him, And so here we have, this is my oldest son Mordechai and his family. I hope I'm right. No, first I have to go. This is my daughter Michal and her family, who from this family we can have already 3 great-grandchildren. We have 2 married grandchildren. This is my son Avi and his family. And this is our baby Dina, that's her baby, and her family. Baruch Hashem. And as I said, I started doing all this research 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, as I started my talk by saying I was born in Shanghai. And when I said I was born in China, I used to say, not so much even Shanghai, when I was growing up, I never thought to even ask my parents, how did I get to be born in Shanghai, Like Shanghai, China was like this way away place that we didn't even know where it was. And as many stories of Holocaust survivors, even though my parents weren't in the Shoah of the really difficult concentration camps in Poland, but they didn't really speak about it. Sometimes I thought that perhaps when they heard of the atrocities of what happened to their families, being in Shanghai for 7 years seemed not as harsh as what happened in Europe. So they never felt that they could complain about it. The most they used to say was that it was very hot, it was very difficult. They never said it was difficult. It was scary and difficult crossing the border. It was difficult waiting for her friends to come to Shanghai. But over the years, even when we took testimony from my Uncle Joe, Yosef, and from my mother, they never spoke about anything being too hard, being difficult. And they didn't speak to us about it. And then more because of my sister, she started really doing these tapes. We didn't have videos then, we didn't have Zooms and all kinds of things, and they didn't take pictures, they only taped her speaking, and my sister typed it up afterwards. We started to get into it because my sister's children started doing the Roots projects. And that's how we got the ball rolling. And that's how we found, for example, those amazing letters that we found. They were just in a drawer, in an envelope, in my parents' house. No one
These
even...
letters are priceless.
What?
They are priceless. They
Right, and Les tells me they're priceless. Right.
So scarce and so priceless.
So it was only about 5-6 years ago that I photocopied them and finally found someone to translate them. And I translated it into to English and the Yiddish, so to have them like facing each other. And then slowly I started collecting different books, and I started giving these talks. And every time I give the talk, I discover some other little detail, something else. And now I'm really into it, as they say. I really feel that it's very important to tell the story. Everybody their own story, obviously, but, excuse me, very important to tell the story even for our generation and for the next generation and the generation after. It's important for them to know. And I see that by what I've been doing, that some of my grandchildren have already done a little bit of the story in their schools. I've gone to my children's schools to tell the story. Depending on the age, I tell it on a different level. And thank you for listening to me.
Now, Chana, I have to mention that you spoke about a museum, and a most amazing story with the museum,
Right. Okay.
which our listeners have to hear, because
Okay.
it's something really quite remarkable.
Right. So with all my research, I discovered that there is a museum in Brooklyn, Sonnenborough Park in Brooklyn, called the Amudei Eish Museum. And I read about it, and I heard that they were doing an exhibit about the whole Shanghai story. So on one of my visits to my sister to America, I said, we have to go see this museum. And I made an appointment. It's a museum that you go to with the schools, or you say that you're a group of a family. It's not just open to the public to just come in. It's more like an educational type of museum. Before we went to the museum, we had already received this book called A Bridge Between Two Worlds, which was written by Rabbi David Rydell, and mainly it's about the different Beis Yaakov, the Beis Yaakov story of Shanghai. There's a page here about my mother. Yeah.
I'll find it for you, go on with this.
Okay, there's a page about my mother and her story, and they have an excerpt of the letter that I read to you, and it's a very beautiful book. And a few of the pictures that are in that book were given to Rabbi Rydell by my brother and my sister, and they have the credits at the end of the book. I live here, so I wasn't so involved in when the book was being written. Okay, it's a very interesting cover here. The picture of the Beis Yaakov is actually at the back of the book here.
Oh, that's the picture that you showed, yeah.
Right. Okay, so we decide to go to the museum, and Menachem and I we take my sister and one of her children, and we go to the museum. And the first person that we meet when we walk into the museum is Rabbi Rydell. And then we tell him who we are, and he was absolutely floored. He said, "What? You're Rebbe Sebastian Milazevich Safran's daughters?" And he was very, very excited, because here he's meeting the next generation in person. Okay, so we come in there, and then we discover that the Shanghai exhibit is still there. So we were very, very excited. So we have this young girl, who takes us to guide us around. And at the beginning of the tour was mainly the story of what I mentioned, of the Jews in Lithuania and Sujihara, and more or less, not that it was boring, it was very interesting, but it was a story that we basically knew, and we're following along with her. And then we come to this exhibit, which here it's in small on the left. And what do we see in this exhibit? You see, there's another red one here. And we see in the exhibit a picture of, here, sorry, here's the exhibit. I'll read this in a moment, okay? First of all, the exhibit, the top is the Beis Yaakov picture. And underneath, it's very hard to see because it's a bit small, is a picture of my parents' wedding.
I'm just going to zoom in. Wow.
What? I don't know if you can actually
And
get
you never knew before you went that this.
No,
that
this
these
was,
pictures
they
were
said
very
it's an
old.
exhibit about the story of Shanghai. They had other things in the different windows. And then we come to the top of this, and the girl says to me, that's taking us around, that on the top here, I'll read to you what it says. The top says, Beis Yaakov in Shanghai. Everything created throughout so many generations is now in ruins, and along with it, the glorious Beis Yaakov movement. But we will work for our mother, Sarah Shanira. Will all our work for our mother, Sarah Shanira, really come to nothing? We, a group of teachers and friends of the Beis Yaakov movement, this is what I read to you before, we must establish Beis Yaakov schools here in the same pattern as the Beis Yaakovs in Poland. Signed, Basia Milazevich Safran, Beis Yaakov teacher, October 5th, 1941. So this girl here that took us around, she just couldn't believe it. She says, I read this passage to all these girls that come here from Beis Yaakov, from different schools, and she couldn't believe that here she was meeting the two daughters of Basia Milazevich. So this was.
Let me add
yes.
that she is the niece, I think she said, or the granddaughter of one of the people you see in the pictures of the refugees coming into Kobe in Japan. So it was like a closing of a circle.
All right, here she is.
Yes, that's the young lady.
Here's the young lady. This is with my sister, who took us around, so you could see the excitement of this girl telling the story, because her grandfather was part of this story as well. So the reason I bring this in now, and when I'm telling you about my whole research, is that every time, all along the way, you discover something new. There's no such thing, they say, as coincidence. All siyata d'shmaya. But you keep discovering new angles, new things. I was just saying to Les before that when we found these letters, it was the first time that we were able to really get the timeline of exactly what happened when they actually left Poland. When they left Poland, when they got to point B to point C, and exactly how it went. And when we found the letters, that really gave us a beautiful perspective of the time. In a difficult way, it also showed us that the letters from Poland stopped in about July 1941, and that's one of the signs that we have that after that, they probably perished already by then, because there were no more letters. Also from the letters, you see the optimism that they had, that they thought, everything is going to be okay, the war's going to be over soon, we're okay, how are you doing all the way there in Shanghai? They were worried about her in Shanghai, and little did they know what was around the corner. So as I said, I think it's important to tell the story, and I am constantly fascinated by the story. And as many times as I tell the story, sometimes have to shake myself. Did they really do this? And there are many amazing stories of the Shoah, but when it actually hits you that it's your parents, that they went through all this and they made it, it's amazing.
I just want to thank you.
Over here, Les wants to come.
Just for a minute. Wow. So, Chana, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This has been, there's no words really. Riveting, unbelievable, incredible. There are no words. And for me, because I'm very involved with stamps, just to touch a letter with a postcard coming from Japan to Shanghai. There's no price. It's absolutely priceless. It's not only is it priceless about the letter, but what's in the letter, even more so.
Right.
And here you have the history. You're actually reading history,
Right.
and you have it, and you have the letters from Poland.
From Poland, that's really.
And I mean, if I could just to press. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And they wrote in Hebrew script. I don't know if they wrote in Yiddish or in.
Right. This one is Japan, and this one is from Poland, right?
From Poland.
Right.
To think this is the last remnants from your family from Poland.
Right.
It's invaluable. There's just. But hearing your story is also incredible. It's been amazing. It's been the greatest honor and privilege, really, and I am so grateful to you. And may you and Menachem have just mazel brocha at Meivesrim,
Amen. Thank
and
you.
nachas from your beautiful family. And to think from those nisim, because your parents were such heroes that they took look what they did. It wasn't easy to go, and they did it. And the Sugihara visa and the Zwartendijk visas, it saved their lives. It really is visas for life, and your story is just something. It's just the most amazing, incredible, and magnificent story. And I really want to thank you, really, from the bottom of my heart.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So we want to thank Les because he's doing amazing work. It's not just that it's creative, it's making a contribution to our history. And it should be something that will be continued for many, many generations. And people look at these YouTube programs and whatever it is, they say, wait, it's true, it really happened, it wasn't a myth. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, and it's been the greatest honor, really.